Hello and welcome to another episode of the djproject Criterion Collection. And here we talk about Spine 222, Diary of a Country Priest, directed by Robert Bresson, 1950. This is another film that I've employed another personal cinematic tradition, and I viewed this film at the beginning of Lent. Now, I'm practicing Orthodox. This year, the difference between the Gregorian and the Julian Paschas are much greater. I know for the Julian it's May 5th. I think the Julian this year is like early April, I want to say, or yeah, I think it's early April. So it's very early for the West, very late for the East, and so there's a big divide. That being said, I do find it interesting that I am talking about this just days after Ash Wednesday, and this coming Sunday is for the East. It's Zacchaeus Sunday, which means it's in so many words, it's a heads up. Lent is coming in several weeks. So anyways, I try to watch it. I try to see it at around that first week of Lent, called Clean Week, and it's because of the story and the themes and so forth. General synopsis of the film. This looks at a young priest who is assigned to serve in a parish in the French village of Ambancourt, and right away there's a clear tension between the two of them. This priest is very spiritually minded, very contemplative, very introspective. He also has a very odd diet of just consuming bread and wine. Yes, there is a symbolic significance to this, but this is also sort of his choice, and also this points into what would become of him later on down the road. Whereas he's thinking about more spiritual things and is kind of on a different plane, everybody else is stuck on Earth and involved in their own little petty things and their own little livelihoods, and they see the priest as this not really a threat, but just as an unwanted outsider. And throughout the whole film, he's making these efforts to connect with the village, to connect with his parishioners, but there's always something that mucks it up. The biggest muck up happens when he is concerned about Chantal, who's the daughter of the countess that lives nearby in the village. And one day he tries to see her, and he ends up talking with the countess, who herself was in a period of strong doubt because of the loss of her infant son several years back. And this is the classic, why did God take my son away, and all these doubts, and he helps her in that regard. He says something to her that moved her and sort of got her back on track. So he thinks. Later on she dies, and then it actually turned into an opportunity for Chantal to spread some nasty rumors that he was actually the cause of her death. That's something that he said would send her down. So basically, he drove her to his grave, and so this ostracizes him even more. He is asked to be reassigned, and actually he goes into, when his health deteriorates more and more, he's advised to go into a city to get some help. And while he's there, he is diagnosed with stomach cancer. And so, armed with that, that bit of depressing news, he meets with a fellow former seminarian who had left the practice to become an apothecary. And actually is living with a woman outside of wedlock. So that's another. So he spends his last days with him, and actually dies in the course of it. So that's generally what the story is. But of course, there's a lot more to it than just that. This would be the film that would really put Robert Bresson on the map as far as the larger world of cinema goes. And this also anticipates a lot of things that would characterize Bresson in later films. Just like with Ozu has a particular style, so does Bresson. And for Bresson, and also probably just as difficult in a certain respects. While this isn't very apparent, what will come to characterize his later films would be use of. He would also be one to use narrative ellipses. He would choose people to play the roles, and he never really liked actors. His aim was to avoid a lot of the artifices of film that were informed by drama. So for him, he was not interested in dramatic structure. He was not interested in acting per se. It was more for him. It was more about. I think it was more about mood and a kind of musicality. He wouldn't call his actors actors, but rather models, and he would choose them. And they would very often be people you've never met before, and subsequently that you will never see again. There isn't the notion of a Brassand stock company. It's like you see him once, and then very often the experience with working with him would be so intense that they can't see themselves doing not only working with Bresson again, but also not working in cinema in general. So you definitely have those just kind of one-off performances, and this is certainly one of them. This was the only major part for Claude Ledoux, who actually died, I think last year, or maybe it was like late 2011, but he died fairly recently. So. But anyway, but it's one of those things where when you see him, you really can't imagine him being anything else. It's like he just fits that role so well. And then, so narrative ellipses. He would also. This doesn't come through as much, although I think it comes through in other ways. He also liked to focus on close-ups of hands and appendages more often than just full-on shots. I mean, obviously there's close-ups of face and you get a sense of characters, but whenever possible, if there's not a moment of dialogue when there's action, the close-up will be on the action, to where you see people's hands like grabbing something or handing something or doing so. You wouldn't see the full-on character doing it. It would just be all done in close-up. And he would often shoot using a 50mm lens, and would compose his shots accordingly with that, because it's to him. Typically, 50mm lens is closer to the way the human eye sees things, and it's a dependable prime lens for for a lot of things. So I would say the 50 and the 25 tend to be pretty reliable in terms of, you can get a lot using those lenses. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but at any rate, what do I know? So, and then finally, the big thing that would characterize Bresson would be the spiritual themes that you can extrapolate from his films. And he is often put into that category of great spiritual filmmakers. In fact, Paul Schrader wrote a book called The Transcendence in Cinema, and he put Dreyer, Bresson, and Tarkovsky as examples of transcendent or transcendental filmmakers, filmmakers that go beyond the surface and speak to something deeper. And he also mentions Ozu as well as an example of a transcendental filmmaker. And this like with a lot of filmmakers that get branded with this, then leads into the question: are they really spiritual filmmakers? Because with, like, for instance, Bergman gets the label of a spiritual filmmaker because a lot of the films that he has made dealt with matters of faith. But he himself was not particularly religious. I mean, he certainly had the upbringing of in fact, a very strict religious upbringing, but he spent a considerable portion of his life trying to shake that off because it left a scarring impression on him, and it wounded him in some respects, and he had to come to terms with that. So it's, and actually, that's the interesting case. A lot of the filmmakers that are labeled as spiritual filmmakers are themselves not that spiritual in themselves. I mean, Bergman is an example of this. Dreyer, I don't think was that devoted. I think he was brought up Lutheran. I think he had a sense of the profound, but he never really practiced it that much anyway. And Bresson, even though he was raised with very strongly, and he had a very strong Roman Catholic background, and certainly that background informed a lot of his films. He himself never really practiced. In fact, he would call himself a Christian atheist, and others have taken that to mean that he's more agnostic. And Tarkovsky was kind of a complicated affair, largely because he was from the Soviet Union and religion was disallowed anyways. But I think even then he was not necessarily interested in just a specific practice, although the sense of the spiritual was very important to him. And Ozu was, I believe he was, actually of the four transcendental filmmakers, I think Ozu is the only one that had any kind of serious practice, and he was Buddhist. But I think even then it was a little bit more subtle. So what makes someone a spiritual filmmaker? I would say that it has less to do with the intent of the filmmaker or what the filmmaker does, and more of what the filmmaker is able to express in his work. Going back to, and this is something that's going to reoccur because I have a few other Bresson films I'm going to be talking about further down the road. But to begin, and particularly with Bresson, is that, and especially with Bresson, I see, okay, this is the disadvantage of going off the cuff with a lot of these things. But anyway, I think what makes Bresson a spiritual filmmaker is because you can extrapolate some themes and meanings and ideas that point back to a particular religious tradition. In this case, Roman Catholicism. And it's certainly I think it's there as a result of the background, not necessarily a purely conscious decision on Bresson's part, but because of his own upbringing, it certainly informed a lot of his work. Much in the same way that Bergman's background informed a lot of his films, and I would say Dreyer and Tarkovsky as well. and there's probably a few other, and Kieślowski to a certain extent. Actually, Kieślowski is an interesting one because he himself is agnostic, but I think a lot of the spiritual ideas is due in large part to his screenwriter. I forget exactly how I pronounce his name. I will make sure I get it right when I talk about the three colors, because that's when it chose that, and the Double Life of Veronique. So I would say that what makes a spiritual filmmaker is not necessarily the filmmakers themselves, but it's either the background or something that intrigues or interests the filmmaker, and having that infused into the film, so that as a viewer you can extrapolate it in whatever way you wish. I would say that it does. I mean, it's been said that you don't have to see these films as a believer yourself, but I would say that it does help, and certainly you're going to get a lot more out of it. You're probably going to get a lot more enjoyment out of it if you yourself believe in those things. It's just like with anything. If you agree with something, you tend to be inclined to it more, and likewise, if you're not inclined to a certain set of beliefs, you may be able to extrapolate only so much. You may not get as much out of it. So, but yeah, this is something I want to talk about further on down the line, as far as the notion of a spiritual maker and what makes Bresson labeled as such. But with this film in particular, it's probably the most obvious, because the central character is a country priest. And the big thing I get from this, and in reviewing this, and interestingly enough, I was not in the best of moods when I was revisiting this film. But the big thing that I got from it was the gross disconnect between the priest and everybody else. I mean, for the priest, certainly he has his own issues that informs a lot of it, and he has his own viewpoints. But he's also coming to face with a lot of other people that have their own issues and their own views, and in that sense, I would say that Diary of a Country Priest succeeds better in portraying that eternal spiritual conflict better than The Last Temptation of Christ. Now, why do I say this? Well, for starters, Diary of a Country Priest is rooted in traditional Roman Catholicism. It makes no attempt to make any radical theological statements, unlike The Last Temptation of Christ. But also, I would say that, but I think also because of that, it portrays it in a little bit more honest way. And I think where it succeeds especially is that it makes it very clear that this is a very human situation. Or in other words, that this is because of the choices we make, and because we still live in a very broken, fragmented world, it's going to cause a lot of tension and skewering and so forth. And so I think it's much more clearer than in The Last Temptation of Christ. It's definitely not insulting in a lot of respects. Now, what do I mean by this disconnect? Well, again, the priest is someone who, for him, the spiritual matters. For him, God matters, and not just the fact that he himself is a priest, but he really feels it within himself that the soul is, that souls need to be healed, that it needs to, and that you need to live in a very genuine and true way. And what he notices is that a lot of people don't live in a very true way. And what's even worse is that people like to stay there. There's no desire on anyone's part to really change in any grand way. and this isn't just repentance, and that's certainly a part of it. But just there's no ambition to want to connect on a deeper level, and certainly to change if the way you are connecting and relating to each other is in a very harmful, hurtful way. So it's and that's what you see in the film. It's this, or another way to put it is that for this priest who he for him the spiritual is everywhere. It's not something that you can just compartmentalize, or you can just bracket at a certain time in a certain place, and it can only exist there, and then everywhere else, any other time in any other place, it's pretty much whatever you want. For him, it's ever present. In fact, one of the most famous lines of the whole film is towards at the end, where he says, "All is grace." It's the idea that this doesn't quite go into like pantheistic territory, but and by the way, Bresson was informed by a lot of Yanism. So I guess I would say that if you do care about the theology, do take some things with a grain of salt. But nonetheless, you can still extrapolate worthy spiritual themes from Bresson's films. It doesn't get in the way in that respect. Certainly doesn't get in the way, unlike Last Temptation of Christ. But I digress. So that's what the priest ultimately believes, and he believes it more explicitly and consciously in his final moments. But I think that's something that drives him on this his own cross to bear, his own passion to bear, as it were. And for everyone else, they could care less about any of this things. Like, why do you? And even some of his fellow clerics. There's an older priest he looks to as a kind of mentor to help him through it, and he's not really impressed by him. And I think part of it is the whole old versus young thing. You young people, you don't know what it means to have it tough. You have all these ambitions, and eventually he does come to respect him, and he admires the kind of the spiritual dedication. It may not necessarily be what he would do, and I think that's probably the other big thing is that his path is really his own, and as I said before, he has his own issues he has to face, and the biggest one, there's this stomach cancer that's gradually eating him away, literally. But also, it's revealed in so many words that he's alcoholic, that he was born into alcoholism, and while he's not typically when you think of alcoholics, you think of people who just get drunk all the time and end up being very abusive. He is far from abusive as possible, but it doesn't mean that he's not. Just because he doesn't exercise those traits that you associate with alcoholism does not mean that he's not alcoholic. The fact that he takes on this diet of just eating bread and wine, this heavily ascetic lifestyle while there may be some spirit, while there's certainly a spiritual component to it, it also is informed by his alcoholism, and to where he really does feel like he really does depend on it. That to me is what really defines an alcoholic. If you feel like the only way you can function in any way is to have a drink, that is when you are legitimately and unambiguously an alcoholic. It's when you feel like you treat it in the same way as people would do with water. And no, I do not mean that you can be addicted to water. It's when you feel that it is such an essential component of your life that you can't function on any level without it. That is how I've come to see it. And I think that's how most people, when you really get down to it, is how they see alcoholics. And so that's his burden he has to bear. So all of these things. So he also, and the reason why it's called Diary of a Country Priest is because he keeps a journal out of all of this. And so and it also shows someone who's deeply introspective and contemplative, a trait that's not encouraged that much in society. We don't encourage a whole lot of contemplation, and when we do, it's done in a very half-assed way. And this village is, and certainly this is a country village, and you have a local aristocrat living nearby. So it's definitely rooted in a lot of old stratified traditions. And I sort of said this when I guess I have to kind of get back to it. I wanted to tie it back with rules of the game, but I guess I'm not quite there yet in my current thought train at the moment. But here you have a society that's so kind of self-absorbed in its own sense of the material. Not necessarily, certainly materialist in some respects, but not. It's not entirely. It's this notion that it's this belief that there's nothing beyond what we can immediately see. So why bother talking about any of this, or why go to any of these traits? And I guess the only way I can really tie it back with the rules of the game is that while the rules of the game showcases looks at the society in and of itself and kind of looks at it by its own rules, if you like, Diary of a Country Priest looks at it in a more spiritual level, and you can see the lack of the spiritual. And it doesn't necessarily just mean that there's an indifference towards religion, although that's certainly a part of it. But I think it runs deeper. It's this sense that it's an indifference to anything that is any kind of indifference to anything deeper than the material, and also the idea that it's this complicity, or not complicity, complacence of basically it's when you look at the world, or you look at the way you live, and you know that it sucks, you know that it's terrible, but you don't really do anything about it. You just say, oh well, that's life. If you say c'est la vie to any kind of just the smallest of cruelties, that I think is a kind of spiritual depravity, and that comes through into the surface with the presence of this. It's almost as if the priest is literally is very much casting a light on the spiritual barrenness of this French village, and it's casting light. There's this you hide in the corner, you shrink away, you're scared of it because you're seeing this light. And now, is the priest perfect? No, and actually that's part of the charm of it is that this isn't some polemic. This isn't some sort of idealized setting like this is the perfect priest who does everything. In fact, a lot of the priest's problems is that he does kind of sort of fumble and bumble his way. Even that moment where he meets with the Countess and has that exchange where for a moment he felt like where there was a genuine connection, a deeper connection with someone else, and that he was doing a great spiritual service to her, which ends up backfiring in the end. Even in that moment, well, I think it was certainly there, and certainly I think he in some ways he did help her, but I think in other ways you kind of look at it, if you're attuned to this and if you care about these things, you kind of go, well, there's probably a better approach that could have been taken. in that regard. And this is, of course, the charm of seeing these kinds of films. Is again, I think of films as the best of films serve as mirrors, where it shows you. It kind of shows you what you are and what you can be, and then you look at it and you conclude, okay, this is what we can do. Should we keep doing this, or should we try something else? And that's what makes that, I think, is what makes the best films. And certainly this comes through in Diary of a Country Priest. So. So this clearly gets my high recommendation. Now, my Bresson experience is still fairly limited. I have seen A Man Escaped. I have Alcazar Balthazar and Mouchette. But actually, his filmography is not all that much. He's an example of a director that has a very long career in terms of years, but only produced so many films. Dreyer is in this camp. Tarkovsky is in this camp. Kubrick is in this camp. So it's not like there's a vast. It's not like Fassbinder where you have like this large filmography you have to sort through. So even though I've seen plenty of his films, I still haven't seen everything. But Bresson is a filmmaker where it's usually said that the later films are his more interesting ones, and I would probably agree with it. I mean, Diary of a Country Priest was a first step in something that he would develop in subsequent films. But you certainly see the initial elements of it there, things that he will continue to develop and refine in his later films. And this, of course, will be discussed when I go into Alcazar Balthazar and Mouchette, especially. But certainly this is the beginnings of it. It's kind of a transition from what he was sort of doing beforehand into what he would eventually do later. It's, I mean, on the one hand, it has its limits, but at the same time, it doesn't. It still has a certain potency and charm and power that's still very relevant and still makes it worth viewing. It's much like with Tarkovsky. I mean, yes, I know that Nostalgia and The Sacrifice are the most interesting of his films, but there is something to seeing Ivan's Childhood, and especially Andrei Rublev, that is still worthy of seeing. So I would put Diary of a Country Priest in there. And unfortunately, this is a title that is now out of print. Yes, and this one you can blame on Studio Canal. This was actually been on my wish list for a long time, and I was waiting for the right moment to get it. And unfortunately, it was the time that I got it is when I found out, oh, it's going to go out of print. Like, I got to get this really quick, and so I did. So, Lionsgate is the U.S. company that is now handling the U.S. releases. I don't know if Diary of a Country Priest is available now. It's probably going to be one of those in the pipeline affairs. They got plenty of other films that they're issuing out. I know you can get Ron through Lionsgate now, and That Obscure Object of Desire, and Contempt, and a few other ones. So I don't know if Diary of a Country Priest is going to show up. But I would say that if it does show up, and this is probably my general rule as far as like when to get it, if there is a Criterion title that's out of print, I would say unless you really, really want to own every Criterion that's there, I would say it's probably easier just to get what's ever readily available. Because to me, it's more important to see the title, to get the title and to see it for itself. I mean, yes, Criterion does a better job on a lot of things in their transfers and in what kind of supplements. Interestingly, there's not a whole lot of supplements on Diary of a Country Priest. You get the trailer, and you also get a commentary track provided by Peter Cowie, who appears a lot in other Criterion films, most especially in the Bergman films. But really, that's all you get. So it's not a feature-packed title, unlike say Brazil or Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas or some other titles I'm going to cover down the line. So it's not the most feature-heavy of films, but I would say that definitely get it if you want to in whatever means are available. And I would say that in general, as far as the title itself, if you're definitely the spiritually minded, you'll definitely like it. I would say that it's probably a good introduction to Bresson. It's certainly the more typical as far as the cinematic presentation. It is based on a story, and it has a lot. It does retain some cinematic conventions of which Bresson would later shed off in his later films, particularly in regards to music and the use of sound and image. But this is certainly the beginnings of it. So it's definitely a very easy Bresson film to watch. Again, it's not to say that Bresson is necessarily totally difficult, but there are some demands and there is a certain intensity. And if you're not used to that, it can be initially off-putting. But I would say, having said all that, I would still highly recommend it, especially if you are of the spiritual mind. If those issues are very important, then I would recommend it in that regard. So, and also to look at Bresson, because Bresson is another one of those directors that's highly vaulted. The most famous praise was actually given by Jean-Luc Godard, who called Bresson. Bresson is to French cinema what Dostoevsky is to the Russian novel, and Mozart is to German music. Basically, the pinnacle of what particularly French cinema can do, and I would agree. I've also I forget who said this, but I've heard it said that in French cinema, Bresson is the father and Renoir is the mother. Bresson, you get a sense of rules and parameters, and whereas Renoir retains the warmth and sentimentality, and that any French filmmaker's worth of salt is going to eventually encounter, is going to have to deal with those two directors, especially. So there you go. Diary of a Country Priest. And until next time, take care.